afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the TIPI webinar series. My name is Barbara Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of Communications and Alumni Relations here at the TIPI College of Business. So we want to thank you for joining us for this webinar series. The series is actually an initiative of our Alumni Relations Office. And our goal is to bring the knowledge of our faculty and staff to you wherever you might be. Now, we're excited to have Jennifer Blackhurst, the Associate Dean of TIPI's Graduate Management Programs and Professor of Business Analytics today. She's here to talk about the disruptions in the supply chain, especially because of the pandemic. But quickly before we start with it, I'd like to mention a few upcoming alumni programs. Our alumni panel on the business of entrepreneurship will take place on September 22nd. Registration is now open and is available on the TIPI alumni webpage. Now stay tuned for additional information about another upcoming TIPI webinar with Associate Professor of Practice, Kay Haggerty from the Department of Accounting. She will highlight some of the many tax changes that have been seen in the last year. Now, before we begin, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items. We have enabled the live transcription service offered by Zoom for our hearing impaired guests. If you don't want to see the transcriptions during the program, you do have the option to turn it off. So you can go to the live transcription button, which should be located at the bottom of the screen, click more, and you should see hide captions or subtitles. That will remove the live transcription. If you do want to use the transcriptions, but they are perhaps a little bit too small for you, you can click the subtitle settings and that will pop open a window where you can increase the text size. Again, these are auto-generated transcriptions and they are only available in English. So today you can submit your questions to us through the Q&A button found at the bottom on your control panel. Type in the question and then simply hit send. You can ask questions at any time, but we'll collect these and we'll do our best to address as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. Today, we are lucky enough that our questions will be moderated by our own TIPI College of Business Dean, Amy Christoph Brown. So finally, just a reminder that all of our virtual presentations are uploaded onto the TIPI College's YouTube page. And closed captions are included with those, and those will be available several days after this event. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jen Blackhurst. Now, Jen is the Leonard A. Hadley Professor of Business Analytics in the TIPI College of Business. She is also the Associate Dean for our Graduate Management Programs. A woman of STEM herself, Jen's research focuses on the supply chain, and her work has appeared in such publications as the Journal of Operations Management and in local media, including both local TV and print publications. She is a member of the Council for Supply Chain Management Professionals and the Decision Sciences Institute. Thank you, Jen, for being our presenter today, and we will turn it over to you.
So much, Barb. I am really excited to be here and to be able to engage with our alumni and friends. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As Barb mentioned, I study supply chain and in particular, supply chain risk and supply chain disruption. So watching all of this unfold has been incredibly interesting to me. There's never been a better time to teach supply chain management because it really does hit home for all of us as consumers. So today, what I'd really like to do is kind of pull the curtain back and give folks a little bit of insight into why our supply chains delayed. Why aren't you getting your stuff? What's the problem that we have things on back order? And we're going to look at it on really a global scale. So I am excited to kind of share my understanding and knowledge of this, and then even more so to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So please feel free, as Barb mentioned, to type those into the Q&A chat. And I am advancing. Okay, so I think as we all entered the summer, we were all hoping that things were going to be getting back to normal. But as we see over, especially the last couple of months, supply chains are continually delayed, and we still are seeing disruptions in our supply chain. And what I'm really hoping today to do is explain a number of reasons why, and then how all of those kind of fit together in a perfect storm of causing delays in supply chains, as well as talk about what are companies doing about this. So it's not like they're sitting back and letting this happen without any intervention. And so what are they doing? What are the things that are really going to work well? And what are the long-term implications for managing supply chain? So earlier in June of 2021, this summer, I was teaching one of my supply chain classes. And right in the middle of that class, we had a really great discussion about COVID and the impact on supply chains. And during that time, there was a port in southern China, the Yanshan terminal, that actually shut down because of a COVID outbreak. And even when they were back up and running, we saw a really diminished capacity. We saw ships waiting to enter the port. At one point during the summer, there was a 16-day wait for ships to even get into the port, let alone have them get loaded and then deliver their goods to other parts of the world. And we were also seeing that at the receiving port. So in a couple of slides, I'm going to show you a couple of photos. We saw that in European ports, and certainly we saw that in US ports. So we do have a situation really of massive congestion. And it's all kind of tied into something called the bullwhip effect, or a ripple effect. And what we're seeing is the buildup and small changes of demand and changes in disruptions really have almost like a contagion effect in the supply chain. So something can happen at one part of the supply chain, and then it ripples through really the rest of the supply chain. So I mentioned a photo, and if you go online, you can find many examples of these. So this is photos taken in California, and it's really looking at ships with goods waiting to enter the US. So, if you're a supply chain manager, you're looking at a photo like this and getting massive anxiety, because there's potentially millions and millions of dollars in goods sitting out on those ports, waiting to get into the ports. But even when we have product coming into the ports, there are issues with labor shortages and just a serious backlog of materials. What we're also finding is a shortage of containers and skyrocketing costs of sending product from overseas to Europe and to the United States. So to give you a little bit of context, back in October of 2020, it cost about $2,000 to send a 40-foot shipping container. And just as of a couple of months ago, and I think it's even a little bit higher now, it was over $11,000. So if you look at some of the pictures that we're going to be seeing, container ships are loaded with these 40-foot containers containing goods. And so one, is there even availability of these containers? And then two, to ship them, the cost has just gone up and up and up. I often get asked when I talk about supply chain, well, what's going to be impacted? And I think the real question is, what is not going to be impacted? So certainly early on, I think we all experienced the panic of not being able to find toilet paper. But you can read the news. You as a consumer are seeing that it's very difficult to get some products, and there's really, really long lead times. So certainly early on, the toilet paper and the pandemic. More recently over the summer, you saw a real shortage of lumber, and that was because of reduced capacity at the lumber mills. That was then triggering kind of craziness in the housing market. If you've tried to order furniture lately, you're going to be waiting quite a long time. Microchips have been in the news quite a bit in terms of many industries, but the auto industry in particular has had a spotlight shown on it in terms of not having the chips they need to complete cars for us as consumers. So if you've been trying to buy a car, there's just not stock of these cars. Yesterday, I actually gave a talk in Dubuque, and some of the companies that were there talked about a shortage of resins that was impacting many of their companies. When you think about some of these products that are used prolifically throughout things that we as consumers use or businesses use. So one thing to really think about is what's going to happen in the 2021 holiday season. So we're kind of in this perfect storm, which is not so perfect of, there's shortages in shipping availability, there's part shortages, there's even labor shortages. So certainly companies are keeping an eye on this, and they're worried about it, and they're doing things about it. But when we look at what the options are, it's really, securing this capacity and really trying to deal with the fact that on a global scale, supply chains are really being disrupted. So we call this a number of things. We call it something like the ripple effect. In my research, I call it disruption propagation. And it's often also called something, the bullwhip effect. And so I want to describe, they're all kind of the same thing, but it's a disruption happening at one point in the supply chain. And it doesn't stop there. It ripples, it spreads, it propagates throughout the supply chain, and often will grow in intensity and impact as it emanates from the source of where it came from. So I have a couple of visuals to explain this. And even if it's just a small glitch in demand, here we see at the end consumer, as it moves back through the supply chain from the consumer to the retailer, to the distributor, to the factory, to the suppliers, all through there, we see this increasing variability, which does in fact wreak havoc on the supply chain. In fact, the bullwhip effect was first named after a study that some researchers did in partnership with Procter & Gamble and Walmart, looking at the impact of changes in demand for Pampers. And so when they looked at the end customer demand, there's ups and downs, but no huge spikes. But as they move back through the supply chain, because of how interconnected the supply chains are, because how ordering happens, because there can often be overreaction, we see these huge swings in demand. I found a cartoon. One of my colleagues posted it on LinkedIn, and I went out and found it. And it's called the Bullwhip Effect. I think this is a great visual. So if you think of holding a whip in your hand and just a small flick of your wrist, where here, all of a sudden now we want to buy toilet paper, right? What we were doing in spring of last year. So what you see then is the retailer saying, oh gosh, now there's a spike, and they're saying, I need to order more. They're increasing their orders because they don't want to have a stock out. The manufacturers are then increasing their orders even more so to the suppliers. So even small changes in demand, and we're not necessarily dealing with small changes with the pandemic, can ripple and spread and grow and propagate to something really unmanageable as it moves through the supply chain. It's also really impacted by the complexity of supply chains. So consumers like you and me and Ardeen and Barb all on this call, we might not understand what it takes to get a product into our hands. And so these supply chains are incredibly complex. They're global. They're often very dependent on one another. And if you're a professional working in supply chain, without me even having to say something, that something is always changing. And so I, as a manufacturer, might know, well, I do know who my tier 1 suppliers are. So who are the suppliers that are giving me the materials that I need to make my parts? Okay, I know who those suppliers are. I potentially have a good relationship with them. I've worked with them long term, but those suppliers have suppliers, and those suppliers have suppliers. So very quickly, this concept of a chain, which makes you think it's just, in a linear manner, can balloon and really become incredibly complex. And so managing that and managing the fact that all of these companies have demands, they all have customers, they all have suppliers, they're all interlinked. One supplier of mine could be a supplier of my competitor, right? And so this complexity in supply chain, especially in a global environment, especially when we're dealing with a global pandemic, makes it very, very, very difficult to deal with uncertainty and change. And so when we at the Tippie College of Business teach about supply chains, we often say, okay, think about these supply chains not as a linear, it goes from here to here to here, very, very simple, but they're often a really, really complex network. And we view it as a network because you have locations or factories or warehouses that are nodes in this network. And then the flows in the network are the materials, the money, the returns, right? We haven't even talked about supply chain returns. But all of these things are having to operate at a really high performance level for very demanding customers like you and I. And they're very, very complex, ever-changing systems. So to give you an example of what one of these actually really looks like, this comes from some research that we've done here at the Tippie College, looking at, can we really understand what supply chains look like and go beyond if I'm a company that I only have visibility of my tier 1 suppliers. And that is often the case. And yesterday when I was speaking with some companies, we talked about that I might know and have really great relationship with my tier 1 suppliers, but who are their suppliers and who are their suppliers and where are they located? And there's risk associated throughout the supply chain in that way. So what we did with this project, and this was in conjunction with one of our PhD students who is now a professor at another university, as well as Kang Zhao and myself, we decided to say, okay, let's try to get an understanding of what these supply chains really look like. So we took Boeing and we viewed that as what we call a seed node. And then we subscribe to a number of databases here, being a Research One university. And we developed some code that we scraped off the web, information that we would need to be able to build these networks. And so this kind of describes the process of what we did. And then this mess is what it really looked like. So we started with Boeing as our seed node. And then we said, okay, who are Boeing's customers and who are Boeing's suppliers? And then for those suppliers, who are their customers and their suppliers? And then for those tier 2, who are their customers and their suppliers? So you can see we use kind of a snowball effect, and very, very, very quickly, we got this huge kind of a mess of a network that I affectionately called the hairball model because it just looks like a tangled mess. But Boeing is connected, the different colors represent different industries. So Boeing, through their partnerships, you can see is actually connected to some car manufacturers, to Microsoft, to Walmart, to China Petroleum, right? So it becomes very, 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 very complex very quickly. And so how do you manage that in a supply chain with all of these other complications that we're having right now? One example of that I'd like to give, and this was even before COVID, is I was talking to some companies for some research that we were doing. And this was back a number of years ago when the tsunami hit in Japan, I think in 2001. And one of the companies that I was talking to said, okay, I remember when that happened. This guy was a supply chain manager, and he said, I went into the office that night kind of in a panic, and who are my suppliers located in this part of the world? Because this then becomes an area of risk. The suppliers are potentially shut down. They're dealing with a huge natural disaster. When he went in and looked at where his suppliers were located, he kind of breathed a sigh of relief and said, okay, none of them are in this area of the world. Our supply chain is going to be okay. But literally within a matter of days, their entire supply chain was shut down because of what we've been talking about, that interconnected nature of the supply chain. So even though they didn't have any direct suppliers in this part of the world, their suppliers had suppliers, and their suppliers had suppliers. And so this interconnectedness, the fact that we're dealing with the bullwhip effect, the fact that we're dealing with labor shortages, container shortages, all of this is causing our supply chains and you and I as the end customer to see delays in things. And especially as we get into the holiday season, I think we're going to see it get even a little bit worse. In the past, companies have really said, okay, you know, there's kind of two ways that I can recover from this. And on the right, you see the reactive recovery, right? And so this is in response to something happening. So there's a disruption, I'm going to work overtime, I'm going to deal with premium freight, I'm going to start expediting. The more difficult one, and one that requires kind of a risk mindset and planning, and a willingness to invest in managing risk upfront, is the more proactive. So where does it make sense for me to store inventory? How much inventory should I store? Where should I have the ability to ramp up my capacity? Do I even have visibility of my supply chain past tier 1? Can I start using really fascinating tools like analytics, which is one of our premier programs here at the Tippie College, to predict where risk is going to be? And do I understand once a disruption hits at any point, it's not just that one point that I need to be worried about, it's how it spreads through that entire supply chain. So on the left, you see where I think companies really need to be refocusing their efforts, right? It's a balance between being kind of lean and efficient and not having unlimited capacity, but knowing that supply chains are exposed to risk. Where do I make that investment? One example that I have of the reactive side of it, right, which is all companies probably use some form of this, is if you remember early on in the pandemic, we couldn't go out. Gyms were shut down, workout facilities. And if you go back in time and kind of look at some of the companies that were really affected, one of them being Peloton, that was really interesting. So people were kind of stuck at home. You saw a huge increase in demand for hardware stores and things because people wanted to do home improvement projects. And you also saw a spike in what people wanted to do in terms of taking care of themselves and being able to be healthy as much as possible at home. So you actually could not find weights at all. Only now I'm starting to see them come back into stores. And if you ordered a Peloton at the height of the pandemic, there actually were delays to where some of the customers were getting upset. And so Peloton didn't want that to happen. And so there were many, many news stories where they were actually air freighting stuff from overseas to make sure that they had the ability to make the bikes and then deliver those bikes out to us as home consumers. So risk is real. Risk is kind of hitting us in the face in terms of supply chain management today. But one of the things I said early on is companies are paying attention to this, and companies certainly are struggling, but really looking towards what they can do. And so a couple of the things that I wanted to put on here in terms of what I know from my research in risk management, as well as talking with companies here in Iowa and even beyond, how are they managing this? So the first one is just having a stronger focus on monitoring where risk is in the supply chain. So early on in the presentation, I talked about the Yanqing port in China that was shut down this summer, and then slowly opened back up with really limited capacity. And so a company that's really monitoring that and has a heads up that that's happening, that is looking for events that might occur in the supply chain, that becomes really, really important. One of the best examples that I can think of living here in Iowa is every winter, it's almost like it's not so bad in pure Midwest like Iowa, but even when I lived a little bit more south, every winter when the first snowstorm hits, there's a mad rush on ice to spread on the sidewalks, shovels, snow blowers, and generators, right? And so we should know, and we do, but we should know that that's a risk for us living here. And companies should know this, like the hardware stores. So we might not know when a disruptive event will happen like that, but we know that it could happen and be ready for it. The second one is ensuring capacity. So what can companies do now and be proactive, especially now that we know that there is a labor shortage, the shipping lines are incredibly tight. There's a shortage of containers. What can companies do to ensure that they have the capacity that they need? I had one example in talking with a company this summer that they couldn't find shipping for the products that they needed. And they ended up, even though they didn't need refrigeration, they ended up shipping their product in refrigerated containers because that was what was available. So they paid a little bit more for the refrigeration because that's where the capacity was. And so it's kind of that agility and mindset that companies really can be thinking about. I think we're going to see more and more and more the fact that companies really will want to understand their supply chains just beyond just who my immediate partners are. So who are my suppliers? What are the risks that they're facing? Where are buyers located? Are there certain parts of the world that might be more at risk than others? So having a visibility of what the supply chain actually looks like is going to be really, really important. And that kind of leads to the next thing on this list, where I'm seeing companies really focusing on, do I want to really redesign and think about the best way to manage my supply chain? And so I'm hearing companies talk about reshoring or nearshoring. So really looking at what is the total cost of doing business. And maybe I don't want some of my suppliers halfway around the world. Maybe I want someone more local. So looking at what they can do to make more localized supply chains, as well as managing their supply base. And this has really been a trend for years, but I want to have really strong relationships with my key suppliers. And I want to be able to depend on them, and for them to be able to depend on me. It really is a two-way street. And so companies really looking at how they've designed their supply chains, how they've evolved over time, and then how do they manage the relationships within those supply chains becomes really, really important. So it's not just transactional, it's about a longer term relationship. And then finally, really thinking longer term about inventory policies. So I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that there's a balance between being very, very efficient and having low levels of inventory, not having too much, not being wasteful, but what is the right amount? And so really being smart and looking at, where do I want to invest in the inventory? Do I have visibility of where that inventory is? And maybe changing some of the levels of safety stock in light of what we now know can happen in terms of disastrous supply chain events. So that, I'm looking at the time, it's about a little bit after 12:30. I would love to hear some of the thoughts from the audience and answer any questions that you might have. I've also put at the bottom of your slide here my name as well as my email. So if anyone would like to contact me, I will always be excited to talk about supply chains and supply chain risk. And I just love that we're connecting with our alumni and key partners through this series.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks for great presentation. We have lots of questions already, so I'm going to jump right in and start asking them from the Q&A. I also have a few from the chat as well. The first question is from Ann Price. I hope you all are okay with me using your names. If you're not, please include a note in there. Please don't say my name. And she says, can you speak to the price of goods when the bullwhip is over and the supply chain is calmer? What do you think will happen?
So I think we're going to see probably a settling down of that, but like in my example of Peloton, there's a cost of doing business, and do I pay more money for the shipping to keep my customers happy? Can I do that long term? Eventually I'm going to have to pass that potentially on to my customers. So I think we're going to see some ups and downs, and certainly we saw that with food throughout the pandemic, but eventually it will settle down. It's that inability to plan for these really big disruptive events, or not even knowing what to do, and it just throws companies into kind of chaos. So I think we're going to still see some instability, but then hopefully we'll learn some lessons from this and be able to gain some more stability.
Great, thank you. I'm going to merge two questions together for you next. And one comes in from Alexander Junk and the other from Kim Harris, with kind of the general theme being, what advances do you see in terms of helping to deal with supply chain management issues? And Alexander asks specifically about how blockchain might be able to help with some of these situations.
Very good. So Alex is a student, and so hello, it's always nice to hear from you, and hello to Kim as well. So this I think is really, really interesting. So in terms of blockchain, I'm not a huge expert in that area. I think that will help a great deal with traceability issues, especially as we look at something like a food supply chain, and do we understand where the product starts, where contagion could potentially enter it, and how do we trace that back? Where I think some even more imminent advances would be a couple of areas. One, looking at something that we call Industry 4.0. So what are we doing in terms of automating some of the things that we can now leverage technology to automate some of these tasks that don't require a human mind and human creativity. So a lot of companies are looking for, how can I become more efficient in utilizing technology in that way, in terms of automation. The other one was that I think is really, really interesting, is looking at transportation in terms of there's a shortage of labor, there's a shortage of trucks, what our supply chain is going to look like in terms of warehouses and different models like a hub and spoke, and how are we going to leverage things like autonomous vehicles so that we can move product safely, and then maybe the last mile of that delivery is something more local where we're not having this over the road trucker issue where there's massive shortage. I said 2 areas, but I want to add a third one is, and this is a plug for analytics because it's so amazing, especially with some of the programs that we have here. How can I leverage the massive amount of data that is out there, including historical data that I haven't been able to get a handle on in the past, to predict where are risky parts in my supply chain? So even with that hairball model that we were looking at just a few minutes ago, we can take something like that and run simulations or look at the structure of the supply chain and, where everything kind of comes into a funnel or there are other risky areas. How can we shore up those areas? And so how can we predict where problems might occur? We even have a PhD student right now looking at how can we, in a supply chain context, look at what's happening with stock prices for certain companies and looking at predicting supplier risk before something detrimental happens, like a supplier goes out of business, which often they're not going to want to give you a big heads up that they're struggling, right? And so again, that's where the relationship parts of it comes in. So those 3 things I think are the big ones that I see a lot of, and that I talk about in my research and what our students in TIPI are working on.
That's terrific. Thank you. Very insightful. And I love your enthusiasm about all things analytics.
Yes.
The next question that I want to ask actually goes into, I think, one of the issues you were just talking about. And this is a question that came in, let's see, and I'm not seeing the person quite yet, but saying that he's a bottled water company and they have supplies that are basically stuck on the Chicago Norfolk Southern rail yard for 2 months because there's a complaint that there's not enough chassis to move from the train yard. So do you have any insight on the chassis shortage or how common it is for unions to potentially get involved with disrupting supply chains?
Yeah, that actually was brought up yesterday when I was talking to a number of manufacturing companies. And so that shortage of parts because of the transportation system kind of shutting down there. When I was getting ready for today, just a couple of notes that I pulled is that the Agriculture Transportation Coalition talked about 22% of sales are lost because of cargo issues. And then this one, I think in particular, congestion on rail networks and a shortage of truck chassis. That is exactly this question. Drivers in warehouses have led to backups as companies struggle to unpack and get things back into circulation. So I think that there is public policy implications for that question. I can't predict when things will free up, but we're seeing even some of the transportation boards and looking at the federal level on how resilient our infrastructures and our supply chain networks. And so that is becoming, it's a massive pain point for this company that you just referred to and beyond. But it's these infrastructures aren't allowing us, and the policies aren't allowing us to move products as freely as we need to. So I think we're going to see more and more policy and like transportation board intervention and making sure that we can have that smooth flow of products. Because for a company like that you just talked about, that they could potentially be shut down. They're at the whim of this because they can't get that critical part that they need.
Yes, thank you. And that question was from Clay Solberg. And I can just imagine the frustration sitting and being able to actually see your container sitting on the rail line and not being able to get to it. And so it just points out the breadth of the infrastructure that needs to all work together to make this happen. So our next question was from Dylan Roth. What are the greatest risks associated with a company not being knowledgeable about its suppliers further down the supply chain? For example, tier 2, 3, 4
Yep.
suppliers.
And that's not an uncommon thing, right? So now we're seeing more and more companies thinking about that, but the risks really are related to the fact that our supply chains are so connected that if something happens to that supplier that you might not have any visibility of, that eventually is going to hit you. And are they even going to give you a heads up, or all of a sudden you're not going to have product? So it's not even specific to a type of disruption, but if anything happens in these really interconnected supply chains, that eventually is going to hit you, and you might not have any visibility of it until it actually shuts you down. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting as well, and some of the research that we're doing is looking at kind of meshing finance research and supply chain research, is the risk associated with partnerships. And so what I mean by that is, I talked about, I am a company, I have suppliers. Those suppliers are also suppliers to some of my competitors. But it even gets more complicated than that, because I'm a company, I have suppliers. Those suppliers, though, might be suppliers to companies not even in my industry, not even connected. But if that relationship with this other industry is so strong, and that supplier's health is dependent on an industry that I don't even pay attention to, I don't even have any visibility of, what happens when their partner, not my competitor, has a disaster? Then my supplier becomes really financially at risk, and then that could hit me. So it's this terrible combination of it, and we have to have these global and connected supply chains, but it's understanding those partners and then understanding their risk. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but if I don't even know who those partners are, I mean, I could give you examples from companies that I spoke to that, all of a sudden they just don't have material, and it's because the supplier went bankrupt, and that was it. And then they don't have the ability to ramp up a new supplier very quickly because of whatever, a variety of reasons, tooling, making sure that the supplier has the capability and that sort of thing.
I think that was a great answer, and it actually taps into the next question, which was about from Sung Chul Hong, saying, what could you use to help formulate standards for risk management in these areas? Do you factor in cost, customer satisfaction? What would some of those pieces be that you would factor into that risk management?
Yep. So I think when companies first start to delve into risk, the approach can actually be quite simple. So really looking at, let's map out the supply chain. Let's look at what are the critical parts. Let's look at where there are bottlenecks, everything funneling through one portion of the supply chain, like a port, and then start iterating. It can't be just the focus of one area. It can't be just the focus of one person. So when we're talking about risk in the supply chain, it just needs to become a part of the culture of the company, and something that's talked about all the time. That is easy to say in hindsight, but if you haven't had a disruption kind of smack you in the face, which we all have had at this point, you don't see the benefit of it, or you might not be willing to invest in it. But really looking at, getting people in a room, mapping out what are those risks. If scenario planning, right? Some of our companies like Boeing and even some companies here in Iowa that I've worked with have like war room scenarios. So, what happens now? We're going to run through when this supplier shuts down fictionally. How do we recover from that? It also needs to be a part of, there needs to be an appetite at the company level for handling this. So my best example of that is I was doing a research study back, almost 20 years ago when there was a strike on the West Coast port. And one of the managers from a very large global retailer said, this was in the news, like every day they might strike. They're talking about striking imminent. But no one was willing to take the risk, or at least he talked about his competitors taking the risk to invest in additional capacity. He did. And as a result, because that disruption hit, then he looks like the hero. But he actually talked about, what if this hadn't hit and I had invested this additional capacity? Is that person going to get fired for not being, responsible? So it's just such a fine balance, but you can't be too far on the lean side, and you can't be too far on the fat and sassy side. It's really constantly paying attention to it, having it be a part of the discussion, and then deciding, okay, for here, it makes sense to have extra inventory. For here, it makes sense to have a backup supplier. For here, it makes sense to have capacity that we can ramp up potentially on a third shift.
So that leads right into Martin Holmes' question. Hi, Martin, which is, who did it right? Who got it right during this last pandemic? Who was well situated and had a good model in place to handle that interruption?
That's a really good question. This one is so large scale and everyone felt it, where other disruptions might be like that supplier going bankrupt that I didn't have any visibility of. And so, nobody kind of sees that. It's all behind the scenes, at least behind the scenes, if you can handle it and not have it hit you. I think companies just absolutely did the best that they could. I have stories in my mind and talking with companies, this division did something really good. This company was really forward thinking. I have some food companies that have said, okay, we know that this is going to hit us. And they talked about stepping back and literally investing millions of dollars and getting a new supplier up and running, buying extra material. This was for like a canned tomato type of product. And so I can't say one company that was a star, but I can say the characteristics of it: constant vigilance and a willingness to invest, where it makes sense as a group of executives really sits down and understands where that risk is. So the investment in not having these events shut you down is an investment. And so being agile, being responsive, and being willing to invest where it makes sense, which is also very hard when you're a publicly traded company and you're balancing all of that. None of it's easy.
And there are lots of questions. James Thomas has lots of good questions about how do you balance, which side do you err on? And I think you've answered that in terms of it's a risky balance in the middle, and you're constantly trying to assess which side you fall on, building the overcapacity or not having enough. So one, I think, really interesting question here is from Sean Fox, that asks this: do you see a trend in companies internalizing their supply chain? So you've talked about setting up relationships with new suppliers. You've even talked about investing potentially in new suppliers. Are you seeing companies pull their supply chain internally to help mitigate some of that risk?
Yeah, and you see that in some industries. Like when I lived and did some research in North Carolina, a lot of the pharmaceutical supply chains, they might own big portions of their supply chains. So again, I feel like I'm going to constantly say it depends, but that is also a balancing act. Do you want to invest in having that capability? Do you even have the expertise, or is a key partner, do they have proprietary information? Are they the ones that would be a better partner because your company doesn't have the ability at this point in time to invest and expose themselves to that level of risk? So it's a risk balancing act. That's why the relationships within the supply chain become incredibly important, and it's very easy to swing too far one side or the other. So the example I can give you of that is looking at developing purchasing contracts with suppliers just based on who can give it to me the cheapest. Okay, so that exposes you to risk because you might not be looking at other things, and so it's not just a general call. Then you had companies switch all the way over to say, I'm going to have one sole source for what I'm talking about, which alleviated some of the many suppliers' risk, but that exposed you what happens if that one supplier goes out. And so you see it kind of eking back the other way where it's these multiple relationships. But do you have the ability to be an expert in that? Do you handle your own logistics? You might not have the ability to do that, and you depend on a logistics provider who has the expertise and the connections to be able to do that.
So there are a couple of questions that kind of pivot around this issue, and you touched on it briefly, but I wonder if you might comment here, and then we're going to have to start to wrap things up. So our two final questions. The first one would be, how is machine learning and AI going to help companies predict this better in the future and get better able to manage that risk? And then what do you see as the next big event? So COVID was one that hit everyone. What do you see as some additional potential disruptions on the horizon?
Okay, I'm going to answer the last one first. So okay. I hope we never see one like this again. So, the more common things that I, as a risk researcher, hear about is, a tsunami hitting a supplier cluster in another part of the world, a supplier going bankrupt, a fire at a facility where it shut down. So I don't think we'll see something on this scale, hopefully in our lifetimes. Again, I think the bigger question is, are we going to learn from this? So do we go back to the way we were before? Do we adjust how we look at risk? Do we understand the benefits of that agility and flexibility that we've been talking about? So I think that's kind of the bigger question. What do we learn from this to become better at managing our supply chains, which is better for companies, better for consumers, and that sort of thing. And then back to the other question on machine learning and artificial intelligence. Gosh, I think kind of the sky's the limit on that, right? So we just have never been in a time where we, number one, have so much data, but number two, now we can use it. And so what couldn't you think of? And so, one of the projects that we were looking at and a couple of years ago here at Tippy was with an airline company. And so how do you capture who is online with you as a customer, and based on who they are and what kind of things they're doing, offer them personalized incentives to purchase maybe a higher cost or pay for something a little bit more, or add something so the ability to customize on scale, I think is a big issue. The big opportunity, that the predictive capabilities on, where is my supply chain at risk, whether that be a transportation flow, a supplier, the fact that I haven't invested in the right capacity, that I think the sky's the limit there. That to me is really, really exciting.
That's great. Thank you. All the more reason to study business analytics through
Yes.
our online certificates or any other options that you have. We have plenty of them with our UPS award-winning analytics department in the Tippie College. So thank you, Jen, for being here today and sharing your expertise. I know you're getting lots of demand for your knowledge right now. And I thank everyone who attended today's event. Jen put her contact information on her final slide. She's also easy to find on the Tippie College website, so please feel free to follow up with her. There was a question about whether some of the data that you shared, such as the Boeing node, is that publicly available, or is that something that you could share with individuals if they were interested in studying more?
I'm happy to share that. I mean, it's in a published paper, and it was data that we gathered from the databases that we as a college invest in. So I'm happy to share that information. So that one, just as a quick aside, is kind of cool because we could build a network based on these databases that maybe even the companies themselves can't build at this point in time. So yep, I can share any of that. So contact me, and I'm happy to talk more about supply chain. I'll never turn you down for that.
So contact Jen directly, and thank you also for just highlighting the importance of how our research intersects with real world problems and how things that you are doing and others are doing in the Tippie College on the academic research side are making a big impact for companies managing these difficult challenges. So thank you, Jen. Thank you for everyone attending today. And when the event closes in just a moment, you'll see a survey pop up on your screen. And if you would please just take a brief moment, it's only 2 or 3 questions, to give us some feedback that will allow us to continue to bring you great events like we've had today. Thank you so much for joining us, and continue to stay informed in what we're doing with the Tippie College. Look for our emails. We're going to continue into this next year, certainly carrying on all of our webinar series. We've been having great outreach to alumni through them. And so if you have ideas, please feel free to share them with us and share them with your friends. They're on our YouTube channel, and they can go back and watch the recording from today's event, probably by tomorrow morning. So thank you so much. Thanks to everybody on the team putting it together, and we hope to see you soon. Bye now.